Anyone who's into cars knows that the first thing you take out when you're making a car into a race car is the air conditioning. So it stands to reason that a lot of people would think that NASCAR stock cars also don't have air conditioning. Well, actually, you would be mistaken. Believe it or not, these race cars do have air conditioners, but it doesn't work exactly like you would think or like it does in your street car. You see, when it comes to what we call driver comfort, there's actually quite a few things that we can do to get the driver as comfortable as possible, minimize the weight that it takes to do that, and maximize the safety with which we can achieve that goal. The most important thing that I want to point out is that any kind of air conditioning that we use will have a carbon monoxide filter of some kind attached to it. This is extremely important as cars do make carbon monoxide as a byproduct of combustion, and this is no different for race cars either. And if any of the bodywork gets damaged, you could easily have exhaust leak into the cabin where the driver is, and you don't want them to breathe that in. We do also draw the air for the air conditioning in from the outside, and you could always be racing right next to somebody with their tailpipe pointed at the intake. You don't want to be breathing that in directly either. The first and the most simple, and one that pretty much everyone will have as a starting point, is a simple fan. We call them squirrel fans typically because they operate like a squirrel cage fan. These are small but fairly powerful little motors, and we use a mixture of 3D printed parts, hoses, and rubber fittings to attach these things to the driver's helmet and to the outside, of course making sure to go through the carbon monoxide filter along the way. Here's an example of what a very simple driver comfort system might look like. You've got the air coming in from the left side window, which is always open. You have a fan, you have a carbon monoxide filter, and then finally a hose going to the driver's helmet. This obviously does not provide cooled air, but it does provide forced air, which can be enough for the cooler races, depending on the driver. This is also a pretty common setup for test cars, as when you're testing, you normally don't make very long runs at a time, and between runs, the driver will get out of the car and they can have a fan or anything like that in the garage area to keep cool with. So you don't really need cooled air in that situation. Another thing that a driver can use a squirrel fan for is what's called a back blower. Most of the seats that we use have a hole cut into the back of them where you can put a duct that you can then run a squirrel fan to blow air into a hole in the driver's insert and into a mesh laid into the insert to allow for this airflow. And despite it not being cooled air, this can help tremendously with the driver's comfort. To get cooled air, there is a company called Custom Components that makes a product called an intercooler. There's another product out there called a CoolBox, and they used to be kind of the gold standard when it comes to race car air conditioning, but nobody that I know of really uses them anymore. They all kind of went to the intercooler. Now, the way the intercooler works is actually pretty neat. You see, we're not allowed to have refrigerants that feed air directly to the driver's helmet, as any kind of leak or anything like that, which could easily happen as the result of a wreck, would then feed that refrigerant directly to the driver's head. And this is a very bad thing, as most refrigerants work by evaporating oxygen, and you kinda need oxygen, especially if you're piloting a race car at 180 miles an hour. So these intercoolers operate off of what's called a Pelchet module, also known as solid-state cooling. It's a little white chip that when you apply a voltage to it, it makes a hot side and a cold side. And it's entirely dependent on how cold you can get the hot side as to how cold the cold side will get. So there's a fan and heat sinks blowing across the hot side of these chips to make the end product on the other side as cold as possible. And then another smaller fan will feed air through a channel where the cold side of these chips are, and then push it out into a hose where it can feed into the driver's helmet. This does provide chilled air. Granted, its capabilities are maxed out depending on what the temperatures of the inside of the race car are, which are usually pretty hot, somewhere around 130 degrees or so, depending on the weather and the type of race. But ultimately, they do work fairly well and can knock about 25 degrees off of the temperature of the air being forced into the driver's helmet. Now, I know that doesn't sound like a lot at 130 degrees, but I guarantee you it feels way better than you think. In fact, many drivers will work off of this alone, even on the hottest races. The intercooler is installed in the race car in a very similar way to the squirrel fan. It'll be mounted in the race car. There will be a hose as the intake to the fan that cools the Pelchet modules. as well as a separate smaller intake for the little fan that blows into the driver's helmet, and of course the hose that goes through the carbon monoxide filter and to the driver. Now to go a step above that, we do have what are called cool shirts too. At least that's what we call them. There are a couple different systems that have names, but that's typically the overall term that we will use. Now the way these work is they use a shirt with a really long tube sewn onto it that wraps all the way around the driver's body, and there's a connector on the end of it. What hooks up to this connector is the Cool Shirt system. This system is a little box that the driver can turn on and off as they wish, and may even be adjustable for the temperature, depending on the type of system we're using. What this system does is it takes water with some kind of additive to keep fungus and mold and stuff from growing inside the shirt between races. It chills that water and then sends it to the shirt the driver's wearing. Now again, how cold this water can get does depend on the ambient temperature inside the race car, but it generally is quite a bit more effective than the air conditioner cooling because they can use refrigerant here. See, in this case, it's not going directly to the driver's head. It stays in a pretty closed system, and the air conditioning and carbon monoxide filter that goes to the driver's head can filter out any leaked refrigerant. But ultimately, this water can be as low as 50 degrees during race conditions, and that is pretty cold. This is why the driver needs the ability to turn it on and off as they want, otherwise they might actually get too cold in the race car. Now, like I mentioned, there are a couple of these systems. Rheene is one company that makes such a device, and they were pretty well the gold standard for a long time as well, kind of like the CoolBox was, and they do still see a fair amount of use, as they're fairly simple to use, to wire up, and are overall pretty reliable. However, recently another company has gotten their hands into this market. They're called Chill Out, and their boxes actually run off of 24 volts, which is double the normal voltage of a race car. They do work off of 12 volts just like a normal street car would. So you need to have some kind of voltage converter to raise the voltage from 12 to 24. However, these systems do take quite a bit more amperage, so it takes a lot beefier wiring and typically its own dedicated circuit in order to run it safely. Plus it is bigger, beefier, a little heavier, so some people don't like it just because of the extra weight. But because it's 24 volts and not just 12, it does actually work a little bit better than the Rheene, so some drivers really like it. However, its strong power requirement does lead to failures at times, and you can actually hear this on the broadcast, as they will sometimes mention a driver on the radio saying that their Cool Shirt isn't working. And this is not meant to shame the company in any way. In fact, Rheene can be just as susceptible to failures because these things are in very extreme conditions. It's incredibly hard to take a device like this and make it as small and light as possible and still make it effective and reliable. But overall, these are great companies with great people behind them. I've worked with them personally, and overall their products work great. But unfortunately in racing, mechanical failure of pretty much any kind is fairly common, and these Cool Shirts are no exception. Now when this happens, there is a very unfortunate side effect. You see, the water that's all around the driver sits stagnant at that point. Now it doesn't get stagnant like a puddle and start stinking or anything, but the race car is very hot inside, like I said, around 130 degrees, and so this water will gradually get to that point. Now 130 degrees doesn't sound like a ton. In fact, you may even shower with water at this temperature, but these drivers have to stay in the car for hours at a time, and that can get very uncomfortable and even lead to burns eventually. And I have known drivers to just tough this out and finish the race anyway. They are certainly tougher than I am, but there are ways to mitigate the effects of this during the race. For instance, you can use one of those bike tire inflators that uses a little CO2 cartridge to pump a tire full of air really quickly, and actually plumb it into a connector that can plug into the shirt, and you can use this to force most of the water out into the floorboard of the race car. Is this ideal? No, not really. It can be hard for the driver to get a hold of the device and get it working properly, as he's really the only one that can do it, as most of the time these connectors for the shirts are pretty out of the way for anyone outside of the race car to be able to get a hold of. This will always be done under caution when 100% focus isn't necessary. They will never do this under green flag conditions. But regardless, this is obviously a much better alternative to burning your driver. However, it doesn't have to be that complicated either. Many drivers will actually just take a little sandwich bag that's full of ice on a pit stop. The driver service member will just toss it in through the opening in the window. And under caution, the driver will loosen his shoulder belts, stuff the bag into their fire suit, zip it back up, and tighten their belts back down, and they're ready to go. If it's early enough in the race that you need to make more than one pit stop, they will usually take a new ice bag every pit stop, as it doesn't take long for this ice to melt at 130 degrees. But it still stays much cooler than the water in the shirt could be if it's left unattended.
Let's listen into the radio on the 98.
It's really hot water.
Yeah, I need you to unplug it. I'm going to give you the hose to drain it at the pit stop as well as 2 bags of ice, okay?
Yeah, I unplugged it.
Make sure you get that hose plugged into that shirt so that water doesn't boil since it's not circulating, okay? You get it drained out?
I have no clue, man. I'm over it. I just want to... I'm not going to say it. I'm okay. Evan, I don't care what you say. From now on, before this race car gets in the trailer, it has an air conditioner and a cool shirt.
In fact, this actually works well enough that a lot of drivers that don't use a cool shirt will use this method instead to keep their core temperatures low. And a driver can use one of these things, or any combination of them really, to help keep comfortable inside the race car. We don't have to run any of them in particular, but you always need something to mitigate the high temperatures of the inside of a race car. And so, as you see, we do have air conditioners in these race cars, but they don't really work anything like your air conditioner in your street car. But that's just one more thing that makes these stock cars far from stock. Hey, don't forget, if you like what you saw, maybe give the video a like and maybe even subscribe if you want to see more. Don't forget to leave topic suggestions down in the comments below, as that will really help me make sure that I'm bringing you guys the information you want.